The river gave us no ditch to crawl into. When the first burst cracked from the bank, all that stood between our crew and being dead in the water was the sound under my boots. 2 diesel engines still turning. I was an Engineman Third Class aboard a USA Navy patrol boat, River, on the Vam Co Dong River in Vietnam. It was July 10th, 1969. The boat was small, fast, and built for shallow water, but it was not a shield. Fiberglass, metal, weapons, fuel, radios, men, and noise, all packed into a few exposed feet of deck. Our patrol was not just another run up a brown river. The Vam Co Dong was a route. Boats, supplies, patrols, local movement, enemy movement, all of it could live or die by who controlled the water and the banks around it. If the river belonged to the enemy after dark, he could move men, weapons, information, and pressure through country that looked empty on a map. Our job was to make that harder. Patrol the river, watch the banks, check movement, respond fast, keep the waterway from becoming a safe road for the enemy. That was the larger mission, but when the bank opened fire, the mission shrank to one brutal fact. If the engines kept turning, the boat still had choices. If the engines quit, the banks could close around us. The first seconds did not feel like a battle. They felt like a machine problem happening inside a gunfight. The coxswain needed speed, the gunners needed angles, the radio needed a clear voice, and I needed to know whether the machinery below me was still alive. The Vam Co Dong was not open sea. It bent and narrowed. The banks rose close enough to make every patch of brush look like it was watching. Muddy water slapped the hull. The air was heavy with heat, exhaust, river rot, and oil. Even before anyone fired, a PBR crew listened hard to the engine note, to the radio, to the water, to anything wrong. Then the bank flashed. The forward guns answered. The boat lurched as the coxswain pushed for speed, and for a moment the engine sound changed under my feet. Not stopped, not dead, but wrong enough. There was no time to ask whether it was damage, debris, panic, or my own ears lying under the racket. The river was throwing spray across the deck. The guns were hammering forward. Someone shouted toward the engine space, and the meaning was clear without every word reaching me. Keep us moving. That was the whole job now. Before the firing started, the patrol had the shape of 100 small river moments. A PBR was not a big Navy ship brought inland. It was a river boat. Low, quick, shallow draft, driven by water jets instead of a deep propeller. That mattered in Vietnam, where the rivers could be narrow, muddy, full of floating junk, and bordered by places where a man could hide 10 steps from the water and disappear. The Navy used boats like ours to patrol, check movement, support other forces, and make the waterways harder for enemy fighters to use. On a map, a river looks like a line. From the deck of a PBR, it felt more like a hallway with no walls you could trust. My world was below the gun barrels and behind the steering. Engines, fuel, pumps, gauges, heat, vibration, the working life of the boat. The forward mount had heavy guns. Other weapons were close at hand. The radio crackled in short bursts that never seemed clear enough. The coxswain watched the river ahead. The gunners watched both banks. Everybody watched everything, because the first sign of trouble might be a wake in the water, a movement in the brush, a boat drifting too calmly, or nothing at all until the firing began. An engineman learned to hear the boat through his feet. A healthy engine had a steady insistence to it. It pushed up through the deck and into the bones. Too much vibration, a different pitch, a cough in the wrong place. Those things could pull attention away from the riverbank faster than a shouted order. That morning, heat settled over the boat like a wet canvas. Sweat ran under helmets. The deck stayed slick where spray came over the side. Diesel exhaust hung low when the wind died. The brown water looked slow until the hull cut through it and threw it aside. The river carried life too. That was one of the hard parts. Civilian boats could appear around a bend. People lived along waterways like this. Every shape on the bank could not be treated as a target, and every quiet place could not be trusted as safe. The front line was not painted on the mud. That uncertainty made men stare too long at things. A clump of trees, a bend in the river, a fishing craft too still, a gap in the grass. Nobody needed to say it out loud. A PBR was strongest when it was moving and weakest when it was fixed in place. We had speed, weapons, and a crew that knew its work. The bank had concealment. The river had no mercy for a disabled boat. If we stopped in the wrong stretch, we were not just one boat in trouble. We became a blockage, a target, and a warning that the patrol had lost control of that bend. The crew knew that without discussing it, so the patrol settled into its rhythm. Scan, listen, move. Check the gauges, scan again. The coxswain kept the bow where he wanted it. The forward gunner shifted his shoulders with the curves of the river. The radio gave us voices from somewhere else, thin and broken by static. A hand signal passed. A head turned. The engine note stayed steady. For a while, that was enough. The first warning was not a full shape. It was a disturbance on the bank, a wrong flicker in the green, and then the river cracked open with sound. Rounds snapped over the boat and slapped into water. The forward guns came alive so fast that the whole deck seemed to tighten under them. Brass jumped, smoke pushed back in pieces. The coxswain turned us hard enough that my shoulder hit metal. The bank was close, too close. There was shouting, but the engine swallowed half of it. The radio called and broke apart. The forward gunner leaned into the mount, facing the bank where the fire had come from. Another weapon answered from behind me. The boat was suddenly not just a patrol craft anymore. It was a moving target, and movement was the only thing keeping it from becoming a fixed one. The river bend gave the enemy places to vanish. Fire came from the brush, then shifted, or seemed to. In those first seconds, certainty was a luxury. Maybe it was one position, maybe more. Maybe the sound bounced off the water and made the wrong bank sound guilty. The coxswain needed the boat angled away from the worst of it without running blind into the next bend. The gunners needed fields of fire that did not cross our own movement. I needed to stay low enough to live and high enough to work. A PBR deck did not give much room for fear. Fear was there. It had to stand behind the next task. The engines were still pulling. Then the starboard side shuddered. The boat did not stop, but the vibration changed. A hard, uneven tremor ran up from below. The stern slid in a way that made the river feel loose beneath us. The coxswain corrected. The guns kept firing. Water sprayed across the deck and carried the smell of mud and fuel with it. Someone yelled something about the engine. The words came as pieces. Engine. Check it. Now, the space between the engine cover and open fire felt much wider than it looked. Moving on a PBR under contact was never graceful. You grabbed what you could, ducked when instinct said duck, stepped around ammunition, lines, hot metal, and men doing their own jobs inches from yours. The forward guns kept punching toward the bank. Their rhythm gave me cover of a kind, not protection, but pressure aimed away from us. I dropped lower, used the boat's structure where I could, and worked my way toward the machinery. Another burst cut across the river. The sound changed depending on where it passed. Overhead was a snap, through brush was a ripping sound, into water was a fast, ugly slap. The brain wanted to sort every sound into danger or not danger. There was no time. Anything close enough to hear clearly was close enough. At the engine space, heat hit me harder than the sun. The cover was awkward, the deck slick, and the boat kept moving beneath my knees. Every turn threw weight into my arms. The engines filled the space with a roar that made spoken words almost useless. Gauges shook, belts, housings, lines, fittings. The familiar pieces of the boat now looked like a puzzle someone had kicked while the clock was running. The engine had not quit. That was the first piece of good news, but something was not feeding right. The sound rose, dipped, caught again. A hesitation like that could become a failure if the boat took another hit, sucked debris, lost pressure, or if the wrong part shook loose at the wrong second. The coxswain opened the throttle again. The boat needed it. The machinery had to answer. Inside the noise, the world narrowed to hands and metal. The riverbank could have been 10 yards away or 100 from where I crouched. It existed as flashes, impacts, and the direction our guns were facing. The enemy was not a face, it was pressure from the green line. The reason every second mattered. One hand found the rail. The other went to the engine checks that could still be done while the boat was alive under me. Fuel, temperature, water, loose gear, anything that might turn a rough engine into a dead one. The boat slammed over its own wake as the coxswain maneuvered. My shoulder hit the side. A tool slipped and clattered somewhere I could not chase. A fresh wave of gunfire cracked from the bank, and the forward guns answered with a deeper, steadier violence. The deck above me carried the movement of the crew like a second language, boots shifting, a gunner bracing, the coxswain working the boat. Someone on the radio trying to make our position and problem understood through static, engine roar, and gunfire. The engine coughed again. This time the hesitation lasted long enough for my stomach to tighten before the sound caught. The boat kept speed, but not cleanly. On open water, a rough engine is maintenance. In a river ambush, it is a countdown. If we died there, the patrol died with us. The river bend stayed hostile. The enemy fire position stayed unreported or half-reported. Any friendly movement behind us would have to treat the whole stretch as a question mark. So the engines were not just machinery, they were the difference between passing through the ambush and becoming part of it. I forced myself to slow down just enough to be useful. Panic wastes hands. A loose connection, a bad feed, heat, debris in the system, damage I could not see. Any of it could explain the sound. The trick was not to solve every possibility. The trick was to find the thing that would kill us first. The gauges shook but stayed within a range I could live with. The heat was brutal. Sweat ran into my eyes. The boat turned again, and the movement shoved me against the machinery. The engine note dipped as the hull fought the river and then rose when the water jets bit. Still alive, still pushing. A shout came from above. The words were mostly lost, but the urgency was not. The coxswain wanted power. The whole crew wanted power. The boat wanted to leap out of that stretch of river, but a PBR only did what its engines allowed. A fitting near the engine space had shifted where it should not have. Maybe the burst of movement had done it. Maybe the vibration had been working it loose longer than I knew. It did not matter. My hand went to it, then slipped. The metal was hot enough to make me pull back. The next attempt held. The engine sound steadied by a small amount, not perfect, not pretty, but steadier. Enough to keep working. Enough for the coxswain to use. Above me, the boat's weapons kept their attention on the bank. The forward gunner stayed locked toward the threat. Nobody had the luxury of watching me work. That was how it had to be. A crew survives when each man handles the piece in front of him. The boat swung, then surged. For a few seconds, the river widened ahead. The coxswain drove for that opening. Fire still came from behind and off the side, but the angle was changing. That mattered. Every yard altered the problem. Every second of speed made the bank less powerful. Then came the second jolt. Something struck or slammed close enough to make the hull ring. I could not tell what it was. The engine noise buried the answer. The boat skipped in the water. A voice shouted from aft. The smell of fuel seemed sharper, or maybe fear made every smell sharper. Fuel was the one thought that cut cleanly through the rest. Fuel and fire. I checked what I could reach. No spray, no obvious flood of liquid, no immediate sign that the boat was about to become something worse than a target. The engines kept their rough, driving thunder. Good enough had to be victory for the next 10 seconds. The coxswain pushed us harder. The guns were still firing, but now the bursts felt less like a wall and more like something chasing us. The bank was sliding past. The river bend opened. The boat had room to move, and the engine note, still imperfect, stayed with us. A man can make himself very small in a moment like that. Small enough to fit behind a cover. Small enough to think only about a gauge needle. Small enough to believe that if one hand stays firm and one engine keeps turning, the whole river might let you pass. The PBR threw spray over the side as it accelerated. The water jets caught cleanly. The engines rose together, and for the first time since the firing began, the sound under my boots felt like an answer instead of a question. We were not safe, but we were moving. The river did not change all at once. There was no clean line where the danger ended. The firing thinned, then returned in scattered cracks, then fell behind the engine noise. The gunners kept watching the banks. The coxswain did not relax. Nobody turned the boat into a parade because it had survived one stretch of river. On a PBR, relief came in pieces. First, the engine stayed with us through the next turn. Then the water ahead opened enough to give the coxswain choices. Then the radio became something other than static and broken urgency. Then a man who had been crouched too low for too long finally shifted his weight and discovered his legs still worked. The boat smelled of hot metal, river water, exhaust, and burned powder. Spent brass lay where it had fallen. The deck was wet. Gear had shifted. Every surface seemed louder than before. The slap of water, the rattle of loose metal, the breathing of men trying not to show how hard they had been breathing. My hands were shaking when the work slowed. That annoyed me more than frightened me. They had been steady when it mattered, and now they wanted to make up for it. I wiped them on my trousers and went back to checking what could be checked. Engines first, always engines. A boat could come out of fire and still die from neglect if nobody listened to it afterward. Gauges, lines, heat, smell, bilge, fuel, anything out of place, anything waiting to become a second emergency. The coxswain asked for what I could give him, and the answer was not a speech. The engines were running. The boat could answer the throttle. We had to watch the roughness, but we had power. That was enough to keep the next decision possible. The banks slid by in a blur of green and brown. They looked almost ordinary again, which was the trick of that river. A place could be quiet after trying to kill you. A bend could look empty after hiding fire. The water took the sound and carried it away. I looked at the machinery and then toward the crew. The forward gunner was still at his weapon, watching the bank as if the whole fight might start again from one leaf moving wrong. The radio man kept his head close to the set. The coxswain stayed over the controls, reading the river ahead. Nobody needed to explain what had almost happened. A small boat on a hostile river depends on many things: courage, training, weapons, luck, and the man steering it. But it also depends on the parts no one thinks about until they begin to fail. Fuel moving where it should, heat staying where it belongs, metal holding together, engines turning underfoot. That day, inside the noise and spray and gunfire, my part of the fight was not to command the river or understand the whole war. It was to keep the boat alive long enough for the crew to get through the worst stretch of water and report that the bend was not empty, not safe, and not free for the enemy to use without being challenged. When the firing had faded behind us and the engines settled into their rough, faithful rhythm, I kept one hand on the warm metal and listened. For a long while, that sound was the only answer I needed.
This reconstruction was inspired by the documented actions of Michael the 50th Gates, an Engineman Third Class in the U.S. Navy serving in PBR Riverine combat, who received the Navy Cross for the real wartime episode behind this story.